Hey guys! In today's video we'll be taking a look at two of my most recently favorite Square Enix titles, The World Ends With You and Octopath Traveler, and today we'll be comparing the two and see how they do in light of each other, so without further ado, here we go. Beginning with Octopath Traveler, well, Octopath doesn't really have a tutorial. The game is split up into 4 chapters per character, and there are 8 characters, making for 32 chapters. You're also allowed to pick which character you begin the game with, and whether or not you even want to watch the cutscenes of the other characters' chapters. None of it is forced, and since the characters all seemingly have unrelated stories from one another, it's not like the game's version of a tutorial sets the stage for future plot relevance, also considering that it's up to the player to decide how they want to effectively be told and mold the story. While I appreciate this method, it doesn't really suit for tutorial material. It's cut dry, basic, lets you get right into the meat of the story, I guess. And that's fine, but again, it's not really tutorial material. The World Ends With You, on the other hand, is really interesting, at least in my opinion. The tutorial introduces the player to the Reaper's game, connects it right to the overall story. You play as a boy named Neku who forms a pact with a girl named Shiki. Together, the two of you are able to accomplish daily missions of survival given to you by the Reapers. As far as gameplay is concerned, everything is touchpad-centric. The game shows you that all of your actions during combat will be done via the touch screen. Moving, attacking, healing, all of it. It paints a good picture for what's to come of the gameplay later in the game, minus interchanging pins, but that's all. So overall, I'm gonna give the point of the tutorial here to The World Ends With You for the sole fact that its tutorial correlates to the story. It matters, whereas Octopath's varies, depending on what character you play and how you play it and everything else in between, so point goes to The World Ends With You. Let's begin with The World Ends With You. Whether you're playing the DS, iPad, or Switch version of the game, the touchpad playstyle is mandatory. I personally played the Switch version, but hearing what I've heard about the DS seems to be a system that's a lot more built for that type of play. The iPad, at least from my perspective, doesn't have enough buttons for you to play the game. It seems like all of your movements and stuff would be compact, uncomfortable even, maybe. While everything is again touchpad-centric, the difference between things like tap and press for a tablet as such can be quite frustrating when the game absolutely requires that you do those things. The Switch has the same buttons as the DS, if not a few more, but lacks a stylus. Why they didn't include some sort of a stylus with the Switch is beyond me. I mean, it was on all of the DS's and on the Wii U. While small, it would have been much appreciated for games like this. As far as battling goes, it can be very repetitive, especially when you have a specific set of pins that you usually just use. Swiping your finger back and forth can also get tiresome as well. Now, I understand that the game's main concept is touchscreen play, but it just really would have been stellar to have just, at least included an option for traditional play methods. The D-pad or analog stick to move, different ABXY buttons for pins, etc. It could have worked. They decided to go for the long shot with the touchpad play. I mean, it works, it's just not the most comfortable, especially on things like the Switch and the iPad. Octopath Traveler's gameplay is a lot more comfortable, especially for JRPG fans. It's simple, being turn-based, meaning that it can get easily repetitive. However, I think that Octopath's break system adds a sense of freshness with each battle. The break system works as follows. All enemies have a certain amount of shield points. When you attack an enemy with an attack that they're weak to, you lower their shield points. When they hit 0 shield points, you break their shield, thus why it's called the break system. This causes them to be stunned for a turn and allows you to perform extra damage as well. It's really handy for battles where enemies or bosses will take multiple turns to perform a huge single attack, which allows you to plan ahead for it. All in all, I appreciate The World Ends With You's strive to be unique with its gameplay, but I'm just gonna have to give the point here to Octopath, since The World Ends With You's gameplay performance depends on what system you're playing on, while Octopath's is just simple all around. So next for the characters. This is gonna be a bit hard for me. Let's start with Octopath. As stated before, you play as 8 individual characters in Octopath Traveler. These individuals don't have much in common, yet they still decide to join forces and travel with one another for their own purposes. This being said, they all come from different backgrounds, different environments, pasts, philosophies, etc. This experience allows the characters to influence one another along the journey to help them grow in ways that they couldn't by themselves. This can be seen with the travel banner cutscenes that spawn multiple times within the game. During these cutscenes, the 8 playable characters discuss among themselves events that unfolded throughout the game. They each give their 2 cents in applying their own philosophies to those events. Each of the 8 playable characters have their own sense of depth to them, and I find it truly fascinating. I mentioned this a bit during my Octopath Traveler Let's Play, so be sure to check that out for more, specific detail on each character's philosophies and their own depth, to them. But moving on. Other characters in the game also share their own philosophies in between conversations with the characters. We see Ali and Leon in Tressa's story, Miguel and Ogun in Alphen's, Earhart and Albrecht's, and much more. These are just a few examples of wonderful characters who help build onto the playable characters' experiences despite being NPCs. Moving on to The World Ends With You. As stated before, you play as a young man named Neku. Neku's whole deal is that the world around him doesn't really matter. The only thing he cares about are his own thoughts, and that the people around him are just noise. Coincidentally enough, Neku gets thrown into a life or death game where he's forced to form pacts with other characters and to trust them. The development of Neku is similar to Kirito from Sword Art Online, so take that as you will, but what's really interesting about The World Ends With You's characters, at least in my opinion, are the villains. All of them have their own personality and some weird fascinating trait to go along with. For example, there's a character about halfway into the game named Sho. Sho's whole deal is that he's super into making weird, abstract, ghetto-like sculptures, but he's also a mathematical genius. Sho is just one of a handful of examples of characters that have their own sense of depth to them. I'd go a bit more in depth about The World Ends With You's characters, but I'd rather not spoil it any more than Dream Drop Distance already did, so yeah. To wrap it all up, I'm gonna give the point here to The World Ends With You. I personally think that Octopath and The World Ends With You's characters have all an equal amount of depth to them, but in Octopath everything feels distant. Since you don't technically have to have any party members in Octopath, the characters exclusive to a certain character's story may not acknowledge or interact with another playable character. For example, a character that's only in Therion's story won't acknowledge that you have Primrose or Albrecht with you, if that makes any sense. It feels weird considering that you, the player, are fully aware that you have 7 other individuals somewhere alongside you, just not on the screen for whatever reason. The World Ends With You doesn't have this sense of awkwardness. Everything feels connected. The heroes and the villains, they all complement one another and make it feel like the world around you is filled with personalities of all types, as if you are actually in a diverse city in Japan. Now we're on to bosses and enemies. Let's see here. I'm not all too entirely sure for this section. I more so covered The World Ends With You enemies in the last segments. I talked about how they all have their own depth to them and all. I absolutely love The World Ends With You's villains for their character, personality, motivations, and etc. The only thing that I dislike would be the gameplay with the bosses and enemies. As I mentioned before, the gameplay can get rather repetitive when you're just zooming through all of the different challenges and bosses that you have to do with the same set of pins. This being said, it doesn't really matter how strong the enemy is if you know how to use your pins and combo with your partner correctly. Once you do this, everything gets rather super easy. Personally, I only died once or twice to a single boss in The World Ends With You, not including the final boss. The same can be said for the regular enemies called Noise. Octopath, on the other hand, as stated before, feels like a simple JRPG. I say this in the sense that it has everything that you would expect in a turn-based RPG, but expanded to its greatest potential within a traditional format. Again, when I say this, I include things like random encounters. If you've seen my other VGV videos, then you'd know that the majority of the time I discredit random encounters. Not because I dislike them by any means, but because that the competitor usually has a better system for random enemies. The World Ends With You isn't better per se, since you can trigger the fights on your own. Think of Let's Go Pikachu or Eevee, for example. But yeah, I just thought I'd mention that and throw that out there. I say all of this to mean that the regular enemies are just about as exotic, I guess, as you'd think. The bosses themselves are another story, however. Normally they all each have their own, sort of pre-existing relationship to the protagonist in Octopath. While the pattern here can seem repetitive at times, it's the philosophy behind each boss that's anything but. I'll be giving a point here to both. Not because one's bosses are better than the enemies, or whatever like I normally do, but because the relationship between the bosses and characters in The World Ends With You, I feel, are just as impactful as the deliverance of Octopath Travelers, if that makes any sense at all. User interface. So I'm not going to sugarcoat this one here. User interface goes to Octopath Traveler. I'm sorry, but I could not stand The World Ends With You's UI. I mean, the screen during battle and whatnot is fine, I guess, but like the pause menu specifically I feel was too weird. I couldn't tell where I needed to go for certain things, like equipment. Octopath Traveler feels a lot more easy for me. I mean, it's a personal nitpick, but that's kind of what all of these videos are, but yeah. Point here goes to Octopath. Like the UI, I'm not going to sugarcoat this either, I'm going to get straight to the point. Music goes to The World Ends With You hands down. Octopath Traveler's music is super, super good for a classic JRPG that wants to stick to the usual instrumental music and all, but The World Ends With You music is just my type of music. I made this exact same call in my Persona 5 vs Breath of the Wild video, and just like then, I'm not regretting this one a bit. Okay, so for the plot, I'm gonna have to throw a huge spoiler warning here for both games. I normally try and keep, these types of videos spoiler-free, but Octopath and The World Ends With You, they can't really be given full justice without explaining a few story things. Now, the spoilers I'm gonna be giving for The World Ends With You kinda is the foundation for the entirety of the game, but for Octopath, we're going into heavy spoilers, and we're gonna be doing Octopath first. So there should be a timestamp here up on the screen to go to the next section. For those of you, that want to know which I would, victor of these two, I'm giving a point here to both of them. I'm going to explain my reasonings here in a minute. I'm going to put up a spoiler warning. But yeah, so right here on the screen, there should be a timestamp of the next section for those of you who want to skip it. But moving on, spoiler in 3, 2, 1. So for Octopath Traveler, like I've said more than a handful of times, you play as 8 individual characters. They each have their own reasons for traveling and setting out on a journey, so we're going to summarize the basics here for you a bit. Ophelia is trying to prove that she has what it takes to be a leader. She goes around the country helping local churches. Eventually she gets thrown into this cult-like village which tries to kill her. Cyrus is trying to find a mysterious lost tome that belonged to his local library. I believe it was like a decade. It was either a decade or 12 years ago. So he goes around the country finding clues and such for the tome. Eventually, he gets betrayed by one of his old colleagues, he gets betrayed by his old boss. Tressa is trying to have her own adventure as a merchant. She goes around the country filling out the remaining half of a journal written by an unnamed author. Albric is trying to find a reason to continue being a warrior. He goes around the country wanting answers, eventually finding them, but unsure how to react. Primrose is trying to find her father's murderers. She goes around the country doing whatever it takes to enact revenge for her father. Alphen is trying to become an apothecary. He goes around the country healing those who need healed, whether they deserve it or not. Therion is trying to get out of blackmail. He goes around the country collecting these stolen gems while avoiding demons of his past. Finally, we have Hanet, trying to find her master. She goes around the country finding clues as to what her master was hunting and how he's currently doing. Alright, so that's about it for the base game of Octopath Traveler. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper into the post-game and see how the post-game connects the stories of these 8 characters a bit. See, the post-game has multiple side quests, which introduce a new character named Kit. Kit is the son of a man named Graham Crossford, and descendant of the great Odin Crossford. Within the lore of Octopath Traveler, Odin was the one who sealed away the evil god Galdera after he tried to overthrow the other 12 gods and seize their power. Galdera's daughter, Black, has been after a descendant of Odin's for ages. She came across Graham and decided that he'd be the best vessel suited to break Galdera's seal. Before Graham became completely immersed by her spells, however, he escaped, at the cost of losing bits and pieces of his humanity. He ends up becoming the beast that Hanet's master was hunting. He also becomes the original author of Tressa's journal, and the savior of Alphen when he was sick as a child. All this being said and done, however, Black then decides to trick Kit into becoming the new vessel, and it's up to the 8 playable characters to defeat Galdera head-on. The other characters' stories are more so connected in extremely specific relationships. For example, the items that Therion collects are the same items that Odin used to seal Galdera away. The tome that Cyrus is looking for is used in relation to Black's spells of turning people immortal or into the vessels. There's also a few more connections too, between like Primrose and whatnot, but I'll leave those for you. The World Ends With You has a few spoilers within itself. I mentioned before how Neku is thrown into a life or death game that supposedly only lasts for 1 week, 7 days. The game throws this 7-day format out the window a little bit into the game and requires that Neku actually play the Reaper's game a whopping 3 times, being 3 weeks and 21 days. I won't spoil, anything such as hidden character motivations and all that, but that was pretty much the big kicker that needed some foundational base explaining. The fact that he's not in it for 1 week, he's in it for 3. But yeah. Throughout Neku's days in the Reaper's game, he's assigned to missions he's to accomplish with the help of a partner. Without a partner, he's unable to defend himself from the creatures called Noise, which are controlled by the Reapers. On the 7th and final day, the Reapers, however, are able to attack the players directly. They no longer need to use the Noise, they can attack them willy-nilly directly. This is the general consensus of the plot. There's a few extra rules here, and like how you're supposed to enter the Reaper's game and all this and that, but I won't spoil those. It's nothing too terribly major of a spoiler, but it does set up for some interesting character development later that I just rather have you all enjoy individually. All in all, I absolutely adore Octopath Traveler for its cleverness and utilizing the post-game as the branch between all the playable characters, villains, and even some NPCs. Where I think the game lacks, however, is a continual pushing drive for all the characters in a grand scheme of things. See, playing through the game, it's real easy to get attached to a certain character's storyline. This can typically cause the player to only care about a certain character's story, and thus not caring about the other ones. The characters' plots obviously hit a climax at a point, but only within their own story. Having to begin and end another character's chapter, then move on to the next one, constantly reminds the player that they're playing a game that's actively trying to disconnect itself within itself. It's a weird concept, and it definitely works because the post-game does wrap everything up in a nice little bow. I enjoyed it, but it is admittedly weird. The World Ends With You has a normal story in the sense of its deliverance. You play as one character, you play the game through their eyes, you're not constantly shifting between different stories, it's all within the same perspective. It, in this sense, is simple. The idea of the Reaper's game too, and each character's own personalities, adds to one another's philosophies, and it's something that I personally just thrive on. So for this section, I'm going to give a point here to the two of them in their own right, as I mentioned before. But sorry guys, I wasn't strong enough to pick a winner of the stories. I really did love them both. But moving on. So neither game actually has DLC. The closest thing here is that The World Ends With You has been given 2 remixes, or remakes I guess if you want to call it that. There was the solo remix, which was the iPad version, if I recall, and then the final remix, which is the Switch version. Now, I know that they both have included some new content with new characters and stuff like that, but for whatever reason, and I kid you not, I cannot find any of that content, like, for real. I can't find anything online about the new content from either of those versions. So I don't know if, just no one's played it, or if just no one's posted it online, or if it actually doesn't exist, or if I'm just not looking hard enough. But if someone could seriously show me in the comments what I'm looking for, that'd be great, because I would love to see, all of the extra content from the solo and the final remix, but because I can't find it at all. Not in the games, and not online. This aside, I can't technically give either a point here, but if I could, it would probably be The World Ends With You, but I'm not for the sake because they don't technically have DLC. Alright, so to finish this super long essay of a video off, the maps and explorable areas. To make this short and sweet, I'm going to give a point here to both. I love the aesthetic and the look of The World Ends With You's explorable areas, but I don't actually like the layout. I would always get lost moving along Shibuya, and the map didn't help much either, being abbreviated weirdly. I don't know, I just admittedly could not read the map. Octopath Traveler's explorable areas were a lot more friendly for my taste, however it was also, just like one Greenland to another. While it's beautiful in its 2D HD style, it's not anything that I haven't seen from other JRPGs in a 2D or 3D setting. The environment of Shibuya is something that I personally haven't experienced in too many other JRPGs before, and I really liked it. Having the people's diversity of personalities in Shibuya too helped the city shine a lot more. So again, point to both here. So guys, The World Ends With You versus Octopath Traveler. I've been really wanting to talk about Octopath ever since I beat it, and I've been desperately looking for a good game to compare it to. Normally, I'd like to compare games that were made by different companies, that way there's more room of a difference in style, but I think that this discussion adds a lot of food for thought. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are on the two games in the comments below, I'd love to read it. So this is Jake, logging out, peace.